Hi. So here we are with Behn. Now I will say she is a little bit out of chronological order. It just sort of has to be that way with the syllabus. Sorry about that. But Behn is basically a contemporary of Dryden. She is a contemporary of Dryden's. She's associated with the Restoration and the Stuarts. Remember the Stuarts? The original James I, and then Charles I, and then Charles II after the Restoration, and then his brother James II, who is eventually, of course, deposed in what we call the Glorious Revolution, which occurs in 1688, and Behn dies just shortly after, right? Just a year later. So she did not have to deal with that for very long. Now, Behn kind of represents a few interesting things for us. First of all, she is part of the group of writers that we start looking at who are basically professional writers. Okay, and we talked about that already, just in the sense that previously, with the exception of the playwrights like Marlowe and Shakespeare and Congreve, right, the other writers are basically writing either one for patrons or just basically for the heck of it, right? I think of Chaucer, for example. Right, he wasn't making any money off of writing the Canterbury Tales, but it was something that he did, right? Now, in the Restoration period, you start to get a more literate public. In other words, there's a market for it, okay? There's a market. Now, the other thing, of course, is this is a woman, right? We talked about Dryden, for example, writing for money after he lost his post as poet laureate. But he's a guy, right? So it is interesting and important, I think, that we have this woman's voice, we can't say early, but here we are in the late 17th century, in the Restoration period, and we're starting to get at least what we could call the beginning of a modern professional writing period, a very important writer, okay, who is a woman. She is, as you can know from reading the biography in our textbook, which I hope you have done, ultimately, she was, let's say, successful enough and thought well enough that she was, in fact, buried in Westminster Abbey, which is, in terms of the English literary tradition, pretty much one of the highest honors you can get, right? She wrote in multiple genres, including plays. But the thing that we are reading, and is probably the thing that is most read by her today, is her prose, Orinoco, or The Royal Slave. Now, just a word about the writing style. We can probably tell from the poetry that we've been reading, Dryden's poetry, Donne and Marvell. And of course, we also have read Swift, that the writing style is different from what we might expect in our 21st century. Sentences are long, lots of punctuation, including pretty liberal use of semicolons to extend these sentences out. And that is not to say a word about the vocabulary, which might be a little tough for some of us. Pronoun references are, in my book, a little loosey-goosey. There were several sections in the sentences of Behn's that I had to read multiple times saying, which person is she referring to here? Right? Because the expectations and the understanding and the style of the time is different from our own. And that's to be expected. And it's just something that as good literary students we work with, right? And try to work through. Now, the story of Orinoco there's a lot of debate. Is it true? Is it fiction? It's certainly fictionized, at least to a certain extent. I mean, when you have a character, the main character, who is as perfect as Orinoco is, you kind of say, right. But face it, folks, we're a long ways away from the realism of the 19th century, right? We're not seeing that kind of writing yet. So heroes are still heroic, right? No matter what. It is kind of a travelogue, right? There is that quality to it. We are taken to parts unknown to most of the readers. Suriname in South America, for example, parts of Africa. In this respect, it is, well, I mean, this is written before Gulliver's Travels, but it's the kind of thing that Jonathan Swift in Gulliver's Travels was kind of playing with, right? This idea of going off on a journey to a brand new world, right? The new world, of course, being the Americas, as we call it now, North and South. Okay. So there has that quality to it. And because of that, right, because you are traveling to parts unknown, because you are going out of the realm of, let's say, Europe, right, and England in particular, but just even Europe in general, there's expectations that all the rules are off, right? And even though you have European characters, what happens and how things happen are different. And indeed, that is somewhat to be expected, right? I'm reminded of I'm reminded of a lot of things with this. One is there's a work by a French writer, Michel de Montaigne. And if I mispronounce the French, that's because I don't speak French. He wrote in 1580, okay, so that's about 100 years before this, a book called Essays. One of the most popular sections of Essays is called Of Cannibals, in which he is looking at the practices of cannibals. But one of the things that comes through is a sense that while there are differences, there are also similarities to more quote-unquote civilized people, right? And indeed, one of the things that happens in Orinoco, is we see the main character as heroic, but part of the reason we see the main character as heroic is that he embodies certain values and virtues that are quite frankly European, okay? At least in their ideal structure, right? And this is reflected, I think, somewhat uncomfortably probably for those of us reading in the 21st century, of how she quite specifically assigns physical attributes that are European that separate Orinoco from other Africans. For example, they talk about his nose, and she uses the word specifically a Roman nose. Why is that? She's just saying he's got this big nose, right? No, it's the nose of leaders in Europe, right? I know. Trust me. It's the nose of a lot of European leaders, right? Because they're all kind of interrelated, right? All that genetics. And there's no reason why he should have a different nose, but he does. Okay, and that's just one small example. If you're reading carefully through the text, right, you see that Behn is not above privileging European morals and values, aesthetic values, what things look like, what's beautiful, right? The chastity of Amionda, right? Amionda, the beloved of Orinoco, is very important in this story, right? That even though the king has her, he doesn't violate her, he doesn't have sex with her. which means that she is still, pure. And therefore, when Orinoco finally does officially sort of have her, right, it's okay, right? And all is good with the world because they're married and they belong together. And she hasn't been with anybody else, right? So you think about it that way. Right? This lays the groundwork, of course, for later works. About a century after this, or actually less than a century after this, there's a very important French writer named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And if you know anything about Rousseau, he was, of course, heavily influential on the American and French revolutions, which is kind of why people tend to talk about him more in English 2:16. But he talked about the quote-unquote noble savage, right? And the noble savage is this idea that people were better basically before civilization came. And essentially, civilization is a corrupting influence. And one of the things that we see in this story is how that really plays out. Orinoco is morally better than the slave owners. He is better than most of the Europeans that we see in the story, right? He is more true, he has more virtue, he has more honor than they do. Now, a couple things about slavery. First of all, it's a little weird because Orinoco is complicit in slavery himself. Make no bones about it. He sells his own, well, not his own people, but people he has captured. He sells them into slavery. So it's a little difficult when we take on the slavery issue. Now, when he does become a slave, and he is tricked into slavery, okay, there is dishonor in how he becomes a slave. That's a very important aspect of this. He falls into a literary type that has been echoed since then, and that is kind of the good slave owner, bad slave owner. Taken initially by the good slave owner, oh, this doesn't seem too bad. I'll sit around and talk about great ideas, boom, boom, great. But then moved into the bad slave owner. You see this in Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852. And more recent works like Beloved by Toni Morrison, 1987, pardon me, sorry. And even Underground Railroad, a recent book by Colson Whitehead published in 2016. They all have that dynamic of the good, quote-unquote, slave owner who, for some reason or another, whatever, seems all right, and then is replaced by the bad slave owner. But what happens with the bad slave owner really is you kind of recognize that all of it's not so great, right? It actually has not been good all along. You just were a little bit more comfortable with the first owner, and now you're not, okay? And this happens in Behn's story, right? As I said, it's a pattern that is repeated subsequently. But the point is, of course, it reveals the institution itself. That's one thing I want to end with. From, I would say, contemporary 21st century criticism, as we look at works, we tend to look at systems, right? Behn is looking at individuals. So you have certain moral characters, people who behave morally, and other characters who behave immorally, right? And we might look at it and say, hey, come on, this whole system of slavery is immoral. The whole slave trade, this whole thing is immoral, whether or not you have a good slave owner or not. Or the person who is enslaved is a good person or not. It's not like these other people deserve to be slaves, because they're not quite as virtuous and wonderful as Orinoco or Omeonda are, right? And they are taken as slaves. And we feel bad because they're so good as people. Or we might cast a wider net and say, I don't care if they're good or bad people, they don't deserve to be slaves, period, okay? But that, again, that's kind of us, right? That's our 21st century lens as we're kind of looking at this thing. And so we might be, how should I say it, a little bit more critical of Behn. It just didn't say, well, why does she do this or that? And of course, that always goes back to issues of, how much do we expect out of our writers from different time periods? Okay. So anyway, something to think about. Last thing.